So I actually was never interested in becoming an educator. I wanted to be a pediatrician. I wanted to be a pediatrician all my life, but I was told when I was a young college student that women were not welcomed into schools of medicine. And unfortunately, I was first generation, so I didn't know any better, and I just assumed that that was the case, and I gave up that really that dream that I had harbored all my life until that point. Interestingly, though, I then went into special education. And I think what's interesting about that is that at that time, a medical model really prevailed. And so I think I found myself trying to get as close to, as an educator, as I could get to what I was initially so interested in. And of course, this was a time when the medical model, which has also been called the search for pathology, and turned out not to be a particularly productive or helpful way to think about atypical children and their challenges, and particularly to come up with valuable ideas for educators. So I'm very pleased that my life took the turn that it took, because I think it got me thinking very early about differentiating instruction, about multiple explanations for why students struggle in school. In particular, with respect to the work I do at the moment, I remember as a beginning teacher, the kind of youngster that really challenged me were children who were very facile decoders, or they were at least adequate decoders, but they couldn't use the ideas that they had read. They couldn't talk about those ideas. They didn't seem to remember even having read the words. And that really was the impetus for my returning to the University of Illinois for a doctorate, because that kind of child challenged me, and there was nothing in my preparation as a special educator that helped me to know what to do about that. In terms of a key event, I have to say that my career, I owe it all to Dr. Donald Meichenbaum. Donald Meichenbaum is an American psychologist. He retired now, but he was at the University of Waterloo, and he is known for his work in cognitive behavior modification. And when I was a young doc student, I read a lot about his work because I was interested in self-regulation. And his work was about the self-regulation of behavior. And I wrote to him, and these were in the days when you actually wrote longhand, something called a letter. And you got a stamp, and in fact it had to be an international stamp because he was in Canada. And you mailed it to this person, and lo and behold, and today I realize just how special that was, he actually wrote back. And my question to him was, is anyone studying behavior self-regulation with respect to academic activity or cognitive behavior modification? That's really what he referred to it as. And he wrote back and he said, as a matter of fact, there's a developmental psychologist by the name of Anne Brown, and she is studying the closest that I can think of to self-regulation with respect to memory, and how it is that students can use like rehearsal to try to improve their memory. And she writes under the label of meta-memory. And so I stalked this Dr. Brown, literally, finally was able to cross paths with her, and told her the ideas that I had, that I wanted to apply this notion of self-regulation to reading comprehension. And she, of course, was at the Center for the Study of Reading at that time, and she invited me to join her research group.
Okay.
So meeting Anne Brown was certainly a turning point in my life, because she's the one who introduced me to sociocultural theory, to cognitive theory. I was working around the margins. I had some appreciation for these theories, but it was really Anne that, and of course, opened many, many doors for me. So I still miss her to this day. So I think that the challenge posed by these fluent decoders who were such poor comprehenders was really mystifying for me. There was nothing that had prepared me to teach these kinds of students well. I think I've been an avid reader all my life, and it literally broke my heart that these children didn't enjoy reading. They hated reading. They thought of themselves as such failures in reading. And I just was determined that I wanted to try to do something to turn that around. And so that was really the beginning of my interest. And of course, putting together the self-regulation and sociocultural theory is what got me into this, well, what if you had conversations with students about reading, and you shared with one another how it is that you were interpreting text and what you were learning from that text, and what were the impediments to your understanding as you read, and how could we resolve those impediments. So it was really, that was the stuff of my early career. I think a turning point in my career is when I shifted from just using an array of random texts to include in the instruction that we were doing, and began to assemble what today we call text sets. We didn't call that, we used that term then, but us putting together texts where students could actually be supported, not just to learn to comprehend, but to build knowledge with texts. So that was a very important turning point in my life, and I've never looked back. Like, after having that experience of teaching first graders, let's read a whole bunch of texts that are about how animals protect themselves from the elements, or how they protect themselves from their predators. And seeing the richness of those conversations in contrast to, today we're reading about volcanoes, tomorrow we're going to read about hypnosis. It was just such a profound difference. And then from there, I've just been so lucky in terms of the collaborators with whom I've worked. And I've really been drawn to science and how students learn science and use comprehension and different forms of representation in science. So I did over a decade of work in guided inquiry learning, where I was always asking questions about how students are using and learning literacy in the context of guided inquiry science instruction. And then most recently in project-based learning, again, asking questions about what forms of text support learning, both traditional texts and digital texts. What are the multiple ways that children can communicate what they know, particularly in the case of science, by modeling their thinking. So that progression, and the chance to have worked with Shirley Magnuson, the chance to have worked with Linda Kukin, with my earlier pal, Andy Anderson, a science educator, has just really enriched my professional life. So I think that initially I looked fairly narrowly. I mean, I thought I was doing something quite significant to have both measures that were looking at the taught to information, as well as what at that time we referred to as more distal measures, like standardized assessments of reading comprehension. I think today, I think much more broadly, as I think the field does, about what is the evidence of the use of literacy and ways in which we can access children's thinking about. So the inclusion of think aloud, for example, the inclusion of interview, the inclusion of, as I say, looking at students' artifacts for evidence of the ways in which they're using their literacy skills. I think that the area that I continue to think about and am really grappling with is, particularly in contemporary society, really trying to understand how I merge the work that I do as a sociocultural or sociocognitive with more critical theory, particularly critical race theory. I think that, that's my obligation to figure this out, because the resources that we've been able to draw on in our toolkit, they're not enough. And so really beginning to think about ways in which you put really race in the middle of the work that you do. And for me, I'm a complete novice. And as a white woman who's learning about how to decenter whiteness and how to not collapse when someone accuses me of being evidencing white fragility, it's been a lot to learn, but I'm really eager to figure that out, and at least to join others who are trying to figure that out. So that's where I see my work going. I work with in under-resourced schools and communities. I had the good fortune of working with Mary Schleppegrell, who's a linguist, and I'm also very interested in the linguistic take and what I can learn from that as well. So it's just been a real blessing for me that I've just had the opportunity to collaborate with such a diverse and accomplished set of scholars in my career. So I brought along 2 artifacts, and both of these come from 1982. The first is the title page of my dissertation study. But actually, the artifact that I'm most proud of is my daughter, who was born in 1982 as well. So I wanted to share those.